culture which encourage us to raise our kid to get into the right schools, to get good SAT scores, to get the good grades, to get the professional skills, and that's all perfectly fine. But the things that really account for who succeeds and who does not happen below the level of awareness. So it's things like who can relate to who can look at a situation that's complicated and prick out a gist, who could combine two gists. So for example, a little child can say, I'm a tiger, and that seems so simple to us. But no computer could do that, because to take a complicated thing I and a complicated thing tiger and merge them together is phenomenally difficult. But that's actually what creativity and innovation is, merging two things to create a third thing. So there are all these processes that are going on deep inside our minds that really account for who achieves and who doesn't. And if you want to go to a kindergarten class and figuring out who's going to do well in life, you can give them an IQ test and that'll tell you something. But ask the kids, who is friends with who in this classroom? And some kids just are aware of social networks. They're aware of human relationships. And those kids are going to do pretty well.
If you look at the CEOs of America's biggest companies, some of the best entrepreneurs, most of them haven't gone through this sort of Harvard, Yale, Princeton.
Right.
You know, they haven't jumped every hoop.
Right.
They often come from smaller colleges. I have always assumed that part of that is that the people who really make it to the top have this incredible drive, and that, you know, part of it is actually having been on the periphery and being on the margins. Is it also that you think they are better social animals?
Yeah, well, I think that's part of it. Partly they take risks. The self-made millionaire in this country had an average collegiate GPA of 2.7, a C+. The A students can get into law school or something, and they have secure routes to decent affluence. But the ones who really take risks are the ones who are sort of down below, and they're more risk takers, and they don't fit into the cookie cutter model of education. But they have commonly several traits, and there's no one formula for success. But they tend not to be too charismatic often. But they tend to be, and they've done studies on this, the charismatic types, you get occasional Jack Welch, somebody like that. But most tend to be ordered. Discipline, execution. They tend to do the same thing over and over again in a very reliable, predictable way. And so they're really into detail, execution, and order. Those are the sorts of personality that more often than not lead to business success. Not flashiness, but just doing the thing and having a compulsive need to get it right. And then an awareness of how to work in groups. Groups are smarter than individuals. Groups that meet face-to-face are a lot smarter than groups that communicate electronically. And so some people have a compulsive need to soak up information from people around them. I was with Michael Milken recently, and he's one of those guys who just soaks you in. He just wants to learn everything he can from every single person he meets. And that actually is a pretty valuable trait.
But are you saying that the conventional method, the way we try to figure out how people are going to succeed, the way we prepare them for success, is in some sense wrong then?
Yeah, I think we have human nature wrong. You know, I think we have a tendency to value the things that we can count and measure, and we sort of underplay the things that are emotional. We're really good at talking about material things and economic incentives, bad at talking about character, bad at talking about emotions. And so there's this vast bias in our culture. And I got into this subject because I covered, say, the decline of the Soviet Union, and we sent in all these economists, but what's really lacking in Russia was a lack of social trust. We were not good at thinking about that. In Iraq, the U.S. sent in military, but we were oblivious to the social and psychological complications of the place. And so time after time again, in how we raise our kids or in vast policy areas, we emphasize the things we can count and measure. We underemphasize character, morality, emotions.
But you talk about this morality almost as if it's a science. So if you look below the surface, you say there's all this new research coming out of social science, psychology, but neuroscience as well, that tells you that human beings are spending a lot of time trying to figure out this world. And and the crucial part is what? Is the crucial part relating to one another?
Yeah, well, say in the case of morality, we have a folk wisdom that we think through principles and come up with right or wrong. But that's not actually how morality works. Morality is more like taste. You instantaneously know whether something is fair. Nobody needs to tell a 2-year-old what's fair or not. And so when someone is not listening to us, so when someone is disrespecting us, it's not a rational thing, we think this is wrong. It's a visceral and emotional reaction. And so, you know, even in Egypt and the tides we've seen across the Middle East, people feel emotionally insulted. And when they rise up, they feel emotional pride. And the emphasis is that these are deep emotional responses And our emotions are not stupid. We think from Freud that the unconscious is this tangled zone of sexual urges. It's not. It's trying to help us figuring out the world. It's just doing it in a different way than our conscious processes. And in some way, it's a much smarter way. If you have trouble making up your mind about a subject, flip a coin. Tell yourself you're going to, okay, I'll settle it by a coin flip. But then don't decide on the basis of what the coin says. Go on the basis of your emotional reaction to the coin flip. Are you happy or sad it came up that way? And that's your inner mind telling you what it really wants, but it hadn't told you until that point.
You know, I never thought about this, but I have a story that completely proves your point. I was applying to colleges from India when I was 18 years old, 8,000 miles away, and had no idea what these differences between these colleges were. And I was choosing between two roughly similar colleges. And I did a coin toss. It came up for College B.
Really?
I decided, let's make it a best of three. It came out for College A, which is where I wanted to go in the first place. I have no idea why, but there was just some gut instinct.
Yeah, a lot of what goes on, we don't know. It's one of the sources of wisdom is actually knowing what's going on in yourself or knowing how to correct for the failures of yourself. Because we have a tendency, sometimes the unconscious is very smart, sometimes some problems. So one of the problems it tends to have is overconfidence. So 96% of college professors think they're above average teachers. And 94% of college students think they have above average leadership skills. We tend to overvalue ourselves. And this is particularly a male trait. Men drown at twice the rate of women because men think they can swim across that lake and women know they can't. But building bootstraps for yourself to prevent yourself from acting on that overconfidence is tremendously important.
Take us through what would be the David Brooks path to success.
Yeah, well, some of these are traits that we don't think about. So, for example, my newspaper had a great story a couple of years ago about soldiers in Iraq. And they could look down a street and they could tell whether that street had IEDs, mines on the street. And they couldn't tell you exactly how they knew. They just got a coldness inside. And so some people have this ability to describe, to just perceive and feel. Is it
sort of pattern recognition?
It's pattern recognition. And they know when something's slightly wrong.
But now, am I thinking of this the wrong way if I say, can you train for pattern recognition?
Yes, by experience. And so what you do is if you learn to see closely by experience, and then not only see, you have to see, but then you have to consciously focus on what you're seeing, maybe write it down afterwards, and then let it stew, and then remind yourself, and see closely, and then go through this process where you're consciously writing down, unconsciously processing, back and forth like a valley. And then you'll begin to see the world in a much more subtle way because you're seeing the grand patterns. And that just takes hard work, repetition, and rigor.
When we come back, we are going to soak in some more from David Brooks. I'm going to ask him how all this relates to politics, international affairs, cultures, when we come back. You have a famously complex relationship with President Obama. You admire him at some level, but in many ways you're right of center and disagree with him politically. Is he a social animal?
Yeah, he's multiple animals.
And we are back with David Brooks talking about stress as much achievement, as stress interrelationship. It all sounds very soft. And I'm thinking to myself that the Chinese and the Indians are sitting there whipping their kids into shape, making them succeed, and that at the end of the day, they will win the race because we'll be sitting here contemplating the good life, and they'll be sitting there out-competing us.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say in the case of the Chinese, this has been subject of much study. They're not only whipping their kids into shape, they have different cultural attitudes. And one of the differences, say, between Chinese and American culture is in how we see the world. And so if you take the average American, these are averages across many wide, diverse groups, and you look at the way they look at the Mona Lisa, the American will look into the eyes of the painting and the mouth of the character. The Chinese eyes will move all over. And there's a famous experiment, which is a bit of a cultural stereotype, but with some basis, which is the fish tank. You probably know. So if you ask a Chinese or Asian person to look at a fish tank, they'll describe the context of the fish, how they interrelate. If you ask an American, they'll just describe the biggest fish in there. And so we tend to see in individual terms.
And so how is it that American culture, with all its, reckless individualism, has dominated the world for the last 300 years, and China, with all its contextualism, has been one of the poorest countries
as I say, there's no one formula, but I would say it's first individualism does encourage a sense I can rise, a sense, if you tell people these two things. The future can be better than the present, and I have control over my future. Those are two powerful ideas that not all cultures are born with. And those are powerful ideas that motivate people to change.
But ultimately, you're talking about living a good life. Can't you see some, again, Chinese tiger mom saying, yeah, but I want them to score 102 on 100. I want them to, to make, $5 million a year. Your book is more about living a good life rather than kind of high-powered achievement.
This is where I think it's always a mistake to divide the hard and the soft, and to think if you work on the hard, you'll get good, and if you work on the soft, you'll just lead a happy, satisfied life. My argument is the soft leads to the hard. So if you want to really do well in business, say make a lot of money, you really have to understand people, and it's through the emotions you do that. The emotions contribute to the building up of human capital and are not divorced from it. And we have an attitude where you think, oh, if we test, if we force homework, we're going to produce these high achievers. I would say that's part of it. You got to do that stuff. But you also have people who have wisdom, who can read the patterns in the world.
When you look at politicians in Washington, how do you map this research, these ideas you have? You have a famously complex relationship with President Obama. You admire him at some level, but in many ways you're right of center and disagree with him politically. Is he a social animal?
Yeah, he's multiple animals. I would say we all have multiple personalities. My psychobabble description of him is he is a very complicated person who has many different selves. All of them are authentic, but they come out in different contexts. And he always has the ability to look at other parts of himself from a distance. And so it means he has great power to self-correct. And I think it gives him power to see himself. It means that he rarely is all in. President Bush didn't have many multiple selves, so when he made a decision, he was all in. He was just going to be there. Whereas I think President Obama is much more cautious because he's a man of many pieces and many parts, and not all of which I understand or I think anybody understands. But it leads to that caution that we see time and time again, and almost a self-distancing I see. In general, though, the politicians I cover are tremendously attuned social animals on the campaign trail. The problem is that when they go into government, they start talking in the language of CBO reports, and they become very dehumanized when they're doing government. They sort of take away, in many ways, the strength that they have.
David Brooks, pleasure to have you on.
Oh, great. Thank you.
And we will be back.